Refinancing sounds like free money, but is it always the smart move? Today, we're breaking down when refinancing saves you thousands and when it could actually cost you more. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Closing the Deal. I am one of your hosts, Zach Dixon, and sitting across from me this morning is my co-host, Sam Enright. What is going on today, Sam? How are you?
What's going on, man? I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Oh, cannot complain. We've started out the last few episodes talking about another episodes here, another weeks here. I'm going to say another week of technical difficulties. It seems like something always pops up, whether it's man-made, manually done because of me, or, some sort of IT issue. Something happens when we press the button to record every week. Never fails.
Now, is that
Most of
just
the
on
time it's
your
my
side,
fault.
or
No,
is
it's
that
100%. Yeah.
I don't
Mostly
think I've
all on
ever
my
really
side and
experienced
mostly my
any
fault too. Yes.
any technical difficulties. That's all right. I try to tell you to put a checklist in place, but I don't think that worked.
I mean,
You're
yeah,
the
there's
only
always
guy I
just
know that's
variables
running
though
out of
too.
256 gigabytes worth of storage on an iPhone.
No, cut that in half. I only have the 125, but yeah.
Either way, 124 gigs and you're running out of space. It's crazy.
I swear. Have to do some investigating on that one. Not too sure.
Buddy, I've seen the phone. There's so many apps. I mean, there's so many apps just open in general. I can only imagine how many apps are just on the phone that are not even being used in general, just taking up gigabytes of storage.
Very true. Very true.
Is what it is, you got to do what you got to do. But I think
We're
maybe
here.
I'll put the checklist together and just send it to you. Just get you a nice little print off, and just every week you just go through and just check them, just make sure.
It's
Mic
just,
set
there's
up.
variables.
Check.
There's always variables though. It's just
not really. I don't feel like it.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. So what do we got on tap for the episode today, Sam?
Today we're talking about the truth about refinancing, which is a very prevalent conversation for right now because, as maybe not all of you have heard, but I'm sure some of you have heard, the Fed lowered interest rates. And I know that for most people that magically makes them assume that interest rates for mortgages are just lower, which then prompts the question, well, where do I stand? What is my benefit? And, what can I do about refinancing myself out of my 7%, 6% mortgage, whatever the case may be, down to lower. So today we're going to kind of just dive into refinancing as a whole, what it is, obviously give a little bit of a backstory in that, what it looks like, because I know sometimes it can be often misconstrued a little bit and just taken for, I guess, maybe that it's a net positive always if rates are lower. And so we really want to talk about what variables ultimately need to change in order for that to actually make sense for you. Again, this is very nuanced, just like everything in the mortgage / real estate world. One person's net benefit is not always going to be the next person's net benefit. So just something to think about there. But yeah, just kind of a complete overview of refinancing when it makes sense, and kind of break down a little bit of some numbers for you guys to kind of help you understand exactly what it is that you're going to be looking for in order to refinance.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, it should be a good one for the timing. Obviously, it has been a hot button topic in finance, over the summertime and springtime through the end of the summertime. When are the Fed going to cut rates and make things a little bit more affordable to borrow as a whole across the spectrum? It has been a very largely talked about topic, though. I've gotten, I don't know, probably 25, 30 emails just from, marketing emails talking about rates are lower, time to refinance, rates are lower, but time to go. It's hot and heavy for sure on the marketing world. So that it's kind of the telltale sign when that's starting to happen, that Fed is starting to cut rates. Things are starting to change a little bit. But as we'll talk about in the episode, not always a direct correlation. So I'm sure that we'll get into that a little bit further into the episode.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there's a lot to unpack in what you kind of just said right there. I mean, obviously for anybody that it's maybe been asleep for the last 4 or 5 years, I mean, the reason that this is such a hot talked about topic is obviously because prior to COVID, rates were hovering in the 4 to 5% range. Obviously, when COVID came, we saw rates drop down to 3% consistently, and sometimes even getting people into mid to low twos, if all of the all of the things lined up. And so, when we then go out of COVID and things start to skyrocket up, and I mean, we have people that we locked. I mean, there's clients that we locked at 8%, there's clients that we locked in high sevens. So, when you go to that side of the spectrum after prior to COVID, having a relatively, I would say pretty average sort of interest rate, and then going down, dropping down in the 2-3%, and then everything going up, that's obviously going to be like, hey, when are these going to come back down? Most people, have not necessarily stopped looking for houses because of interest rates. But of course, there has always been the thought of, well, once, rates do fall, what options do I have to refinance? And so that's obviously why it's a hot topic, is because a lot of people in the last 3 years that have purchased are in the high sixes and above range, you know what I mean? Hitting that 7%. And so, they're obviously looking to capitalize on lower rates. Sometimes I do think, obviously, people use that stuff as just kind of a gimmick, just to kind of get you calling, get you in the door. Because again, every situation is going to be different. I mean, we just ran pricing for 4 different clients yesterday, and it still just doesn't make enough sense for any of them to refinance at this point in time. So obviously good to have those conversations, but doesn't necessarily mean that we're quite there just because the Fed lowered interest rates. They lowered interest rates last year, and rates actually went back up after they, lowered interest rates. So, and it's been hovering pretty steady around that same number since then. So supposedly we will see, there's talks of lowering them 2 more times this year before the end of the year. So whether or not, the Fed and Powell keep true to their word and that actually happens remains to be seen. However, that potentially could lead to lower interest rates. So for anybody that's kind of thinking about it, obviously feel free to reach out, have those conversations with your current lender or whoever you use, or give us a call. But may not be the perfect time to jump in the driver's seat and take that one. Maybe we just kind of sit back and wait and see what they decide to do, obviously moving forward as well, especially if they're going to continue to cut them.
For sure, for sure. And I think that is kind of how we'll get started in the episode too. We'll talk about obviously what refinancing actually is, but then we'll, talk about the pros, the cons, when it makes sense for you, when it may be a mistake for you, in those specific situations as a whole. So getting started as to what refinancing actually is, the definition is replacing your current loan with a new one. And so obviously, there are a lot of reasons why you would want to do that. The number one, I would say, especially in our current climate and market, is going to be a lower rate. So obviously, like we mentioned, getting a lower rate than what you locked in to begin with is going to provide obviously a lower monthly mortgage payment as a whole. You're paying less interest on the life of the loan with a lower interest rate. And so obviously when you're locking in at 7.5, 7.75, and now, rates are at 6.5, that can be a difference in payment for sure, and something to take a look at in your own situation. But some other reasons why you would refinance as well is just, changing the term. If you wanted to go from a 30-year fix to a 15-year fix and increase your payment and pay less interest over the life of the loan. If you wanted to, get cash out of the property, if you had equity in the property, you can actually pull that out and use that as, obviously your own money. You can do whatever you want with it, whether it be home renovations, vacation, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last kind of big one to refinance would be to remove PMI. PMI, as we've talked about in previous episodes, is private mortgage insurance. For anything less than 20% equity in the property, you're going to be paying an extra private mortgage insurance to protect the lender in case of default. So when you do reach that 20% equity number, whether it's a combination of paying your mortgage down, paying that principal down, as well as the appreciation of value on the property, you can refinance that property and have that PMI removed, and obviously have a much lower mortgage payment without that as well. So going to be some of the major reasons why we refinance, why we replace the current loan with a new one as a whole. Obviously, right, refinancing is just hitting reset on your mortgage, but all in all, you do have fees attached to. So got to be mindful of that, and something obviously we're going to talk about when we get into why it makes sense for some people, why it doesn't make sense for some people in different situations as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. Just kind of breaking down a little bit there. I mean, obviously the number one thing the number one reason you talked about is usually what most people think of when they think of refinancing, right? They think about a lower interest rate. That's always going to be the gut thought process for anybody who thinks about it. Oh my gosh, our rate's lower. Does it make sense? I mean, obviously, yes, the refinance business has definitely dried up over the last several years. That's not something that we have done a lot of. That makes sense why. Most people that bought in the last 5 years, if you bought 4 or 5 years ago, you likely were locked in a 2 or 3% rate. So you're probably not going to refinance out of that interest rate, seeing as rates are higher now. If you bought prior to that, prior to COVID, your rate's still likely in a better position. And so I guess a lot of the things would be, or, let's kind of talk about what would make somebody refinance, right? What would they consider doing a refinance for, even when rates are higher? One of those is going to be to change the term, if that's something that you're interested in. This is probably one that goes kind of along with the rate, not something that most people are going to jump into in a higher rate, in a higher interest rate market, changing your term or going down lower. Ultimately you can affect your term anyways, right? If you want to make extra principal payments each year, you're going to knock years off of your mortgage anyway. So do you really need to refinance to a lower term in order to achieve paying your loan off in a quicker time period? Not really. It's within your control, right, to pay it off as quickly as you would like. If you can afford it and you can make 2 extra principal payments a year, like, you're going to knock the balance down and knock time off of your mortgage anyway. So, is that something that you necessarily want to jump into? I don't know. Everybody's a little bit different. That's probably one that we see the least amount, is changing the term. The next two are going to be ones that would potentially catch your eye in a market like this. One of them is going to be a cash out refinance. Cash out oftentimes is looked at as just extracting this huge chunk of equity and doing different things to it. If you want to improve your property, if you want to, maybe take out money and buy a different property, you know what I mean? There's a lot of reasons for it. One of the things that I would urge a lot of people to think about, and this is one that we try to think of, and why it still makes sense in a higher interest rate market, is a cash out with debt consolidation. As you guys probably know, if you pay attention, we are in the most credit card debt as a nation that we've ever been in. I'm pretty sure the number's over a couple of $1 trillion on our for our consumer credit debt as a whole, which is pretty astounding when you sit back and think about it. And so, as most of you know, not only have interest rates gone up in the last 3 years, but the cost of just living in general has gone up. And so a lot of people have moved to financing things onto credit cards, paying for, whether that's either lifestyle or whether that is just necessities that they need. A lot of people have turned to those things to, keep themselves afloat, right? And so some people, if you have bought in a house in the past and you own a piece of property, that could be one of the biggest wealth tools that could help you get out of that situation, right? Because ultimately, let's say you were in a position where you do have a 3% interest rate on your home, but you have 6 credit cards that are all maxed and you're being charged 27% interest a month on those. Would refinancing your mortgage down, up from a 3% rate to a 6% rate, but being able to consolidate all of that high interest credit card debt or even personal loans, anything that's going to be over 6%, does that make more sense for you? Or does holding on to that 3% mortgage make sense? Obviously you got to take a look at the numbers and make sure that, one, you have the equity to extract extrapolate in the first place, and B, does it make sense for the monthly savings? But that's something that we see a lot of people. That's one of the things that we have still been able to help people refinance with, is if you have owned your home for 3, 4, 5 years and you've built up that equity, and you do have some money sitting on, high interest debt, does it make sense to kind of consolidate that into your mortgage, borrow everything at 6% and get all that high interest credit debt gone? So something to think about. And then removing PMI. So this could not only be conventional removing PMI, but also FHA. Let's say you purchased FHA, 4 or 5 years ago, your credit was maybe in the high 600s and conventional just didn't make sense at that point in time. Now you have the equity built up in the property. And now let's say you've moved into the mid 700s in the credit score, and conventional makes more sense because FHA is going to have private mortgage insurance for the life of the loan. This could be a great opportunity for you to refinance out of that FHA mortgage, refinance into a conventional mortgage, get that PMI gone. So that's going to save you money each month. And then also potentially, look into, saving you money as a whole, just depending on what the interest rates are and where you locked in at. So something to think about there. So those are all great reasons and to look into refinancing. And ultimately, again, it's very nuanced. It's what are your needs? What are the things that you're looking to do? Are you somebody who's just looking to lower your mortgage payment? Are you somebody who's looking to lower all of your payments as a whole each month and consolidate in there? Are you somebody who just wants to remove your private mortgage insurance, or even your mortgage insurance from a FHA or a Govy backed loan, and get that out of there as well? So those are all great reasons to look at refinancing.
For sure, for sure. Do you want to take us into when it makes most sense for the buyer as well?
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely take a look at that. So obviously, the number one thing is going to be when rates drop enough for you to recuperate the fees that it costs to refinance. So as most of you guys know, there's no such thing as a free loan. You're not ever going to do a loan where things are free. Title company is still going to have fees for doing the refinance. Your mortgage company is still going to have fees. You're still going to have potentially your escrows that need to be set up if you are still having escrows. Prepaid, just depending on where you're at in the year. If your homeowner's insurance is going to be due, you may have to pay that again. And so there's always going to be fees associated with refinancing. Are they going to typically be cheaper? Is your lender going to be able to maybe offer you a discount for refinancing? Yes. Is the title company potentially fees going to be less when you go to refinance? Yes, just because if you had just purchased within the last couple of years, usually you get a discount on those things. However, that does not mean that there are no fees. And so when looking at those fees, we have to make sure that what you're going to save monthly makes sense in the long haul, right? So, let's say it costs you, $4,500, to refinance, but you're saving yourself $100 a month. Easy math, it's 45 months, right, to recuperate that money. So you're talking almost 4 years of time before you would recuperate the funds that it would take, in order to do that refinance. And so you have to kind of weigh that out, right? Typically, you'd really want to pay that back in less than 2 years, right? For it to make sense. You don't know, the future is not certain for anybody, but you have to ask yourself, if you move, is it likely that you move in the next 4 years, or is it likely that you're in the same, residence for the next 4 years? Those are questions you have to answer, because obviously if you move within 2 years, then the refinance didn't ultimately make sense, right? Because you paid $4,500 in fees and you didn't even pay half of that back with the money that you saved. And so that's going to be the first thing when it comes to rates. And this is what we are always looking at when it comes to our clients, and why, the rates have to make sense. Usually, it's not a perfect rule, but usually the rule would be if you can save about 1%, that's when it's going to make sense to refinance. So let's say you locked yourself in at 7, we locked you in at 7%. Now rates are 6%. Again, it's not a perfect rule. It doesn't always mean that when you're at 1%, it's going to make sense, but it's a good guideline to use. Usually when you're at that point, that's when it's going to be, when it's going to make sense to do a refinance, is about 1% difference from where you were originally locked in to where you are, now looking to be at. We already talked about this one. When it makes sense, switching from, FHA with MI over to like a conventional, if you've built up enough equity for that to make sense, that's going to be a great savings for you. FHA for most clients, unless you put a larger down payment down, which it only changes it by 0.05%. So FHA has the same mortgage insurance percentage across the board for all clients. It's going to be 0.55%. And I believe if you end up putting 10% or more down, it goes down to 0.5%. So potentially depending on your loan amount and where you're at, that could be anywhere between 80 to $200 a month, right? And so if you have built up enough equity and you can, go into a conventional mortgage where now you have 80% loan to value and you're refinancing, that could save you anywhere between $80 to $200 a month in private mortgage or in the mortgage insurance alone, without even looking at, okay, have interest rates gotten better? Does this make more sense now? That sort of thing. Obviously, we can still look at that and see if those factors have changed. That has the potential for even more increased savings. But that's one reason that you could look into refinancing as well, is to get rid of private mortgage insurance. Honestly, this is likely going to probably make more sense for somebody who maybe has a larger loan amount, who's built up equity, that has a large chunk of money that's going towards private mortgage insurance each month. And then, shortening your term, we talked about this one. This is one that I don't see, again, as very often, because, again, ultimately your term can be changed by you and you alone, right? Just because you have a minimum mortgage payment due each month doesn't mean that that's the minimum that you have to pay, or doesn't mean that's the maximum you can pay. Excuse me. So ultimately, right, if you wanted to change the term of your mortgage, if you wanted to pay it off quicker, all you have to do is then take more money and put it towards that mortgage every single year, or once a month, or whatever the case may be. It's as simple as that. So just because you come back to me, why would you necessarily pay a mortgage company to change your term? Why would you pay 4,000, 3,000, 5,000 in fees, right, to do a refinance to change your term, when all you have to do is just make a more mortgage payment each month? So if you're coupling that with a lower interest rate or something like that, then that would make sense. But just to come back to change your term, in my opinion, does not make very much sense, when the term can ultimately be impacted by how much you pay. You can obviously pay your loan off quicker. And then obviously cash out for strategic purposes. Again, this is going to be one of those things where, we already talked about it. One that's often overlooked is debt consolidation, in my opinion. Again, when you look at the credit card numbers as a whole, as a nation, we are over $1 trillion in credit card debt, consumer debt. That is insane to think about. And so if you're somebody who owns a house and you've built up equity in the last 5 to 7 years, if you're sitting on $100,000 worth of equity and you're sitting on $40,000 worth of high interest credit card debt, and you're making minimum monthly payments, you're going to be paying on those things for a long, 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 long time. And so, potentially consolidating all of that under your mortgage, paying the higher interest rate, getting it in at 6%, even if it is still going to be far greater savings when you're paying 27% on credit cards. Again, something to look at. Not, does the numbers always make sense? No, but something to definitely, reach out to a lender about. And then other things would be, again, if you're looking to improve your property, if you're looking to put money into it to make it better, do remodeling, anything like that, or if you're just looking to maybe purchase an investment property, or put your money into a different investment vehicle, those are great ways to, or that's a great way to kind of extrapolate cash, is to go in for the cash out refinance. So yeah, I mean, that's ultimately it, right? Refinancing isn't free money. It's just replacing one loan with another, and it costs thousands in fees to do it. The question is, do the savings outweigh the costs? So Zach, do you want to take us into, I mean, obviously we can both kind of, take over this section, but do you want to talk about when refinancing would be a mistake? You want to kind of interject there?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty inverse of what we just talked about, honestly. I think the biggest one that stands out to me personally is extending your loan term unnecessarily. So, say you're 7 to 10 years into a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, and you decide that you want to take on the 7 to 10 years that you just did on top of the remaining 20 years. You're now back into a 30-year mortgage. Depending on the numbers, obviously the every situation is going to be different depending on your loan amounts and your equities and et cetera, et cetera. But when you kind of reset the clock back to a 30-year mortgage, you're going to be paying, the interest that is locked in for that 30-year loan amount versus your first loan amount. So you had already paid all that interest in the first 10 years, and now you're locking back into another 30-year loan, paying the more than likely a less amount of interest, but again, you're paying an extra 10 years that you already did, based on the loan up front. Obviously, not always going to be paying it for 30 years straight. If you're, obviously selling, or if you're moving out and renting the property, obviously that's not always going to be done in principle, how it is written on paper when you sign that loan. But obviously resetting that clock, it just takes time to get that property paid off in full. Obviously having a property that is paid off, no mortgage payment, have all the equity, 100% of the equity in the property. There's a lot of options that you can do with that, moving on when you get to later stages in life, et cetera, et cetera. So resetting that clock, it can, just depending on the situation and numbers and whatnot, it can affect a few things that you maybe don't think about right up front. And then I would say the other one that is big is using the cash out to splurge versus strategic use. I kind of mentioned it to begin with in the first section, when using equity to go on vacations or whatever it may be, whatever you want to do with your own money. Ultimately, you have to be strategic with that too. If you do have $40,000 of higher interest credit card debt sitting out there, probably not the best choice to use your equity to go splurge 10 grand on a European vacation. So ultimately you need to be able to determine what, again, we've said it a million times already in this episode, but it's situation by situation based. You just need to determine what is good for you in your own situation, and what is good, what's going to help you down the road as well, and not just 2 to 3 years down the road, but 5, 10, 20 years down the road as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because you have to you have to think, obviously, when you're using a cash out, most of the loan programs are going to cap you at 80%. So, I mean, you're not going to eat up all of your equity, right? So there's still going to be 20% likely still out there. However, if you've taken the last 5 to 7 years to build yourself up in equity, and you go and basically extrapolate all that, and now you've gone out and blown it on different things that maybe were not the best use for the money, if you didn't, you know, improve the value of your property, one, or you didn't take care of some high interest debt that, ultimately is going to put more money back in your pocket each month, and you used it for different things, now you're resetting the clock of the value of that property, right? Because now you have to wait for it to basically be worth more again. You already waited 5 to 7 years to potentially build up what, 60, 80, $100,000. And now you've chewed into that, to get a new loan and use some of that equity towards things that were not maybe beneficial. So that's one thing for sure, that, ultimately, us as the lender, we don't control what people do with their money, unless like it's one of those things where you have to pay debt off within the loan in order to qualify. That would be the only time. But, if you do a cash out refinance and you can qualify for getting 80 grand out, you're going to get that $80,000 wired to you, after your 3-day right of rescission period. And what you do with that 80 grand is going to be on you and you alone. And, so it's just one of those things to definitely think about. And then the other thing would be the part about breaking even only if you stay in the home long enough, right? So, I mean, if it's going to take you 4 to 5 years because of the savings, you know what I mean, to break even ultimately on the property, or break even on the loan, and you don't know if you're going to move out in 2 years, that would be one of those things where maybe it doesn't make sense to do the refinance. So you definitely got to look at everything as a whole and look at the potential cost, the potential savings, and obviously that's where getting a professional involved, and having them look over the numbers for you and kind of take a look at everything. That's where it's, really, really vitally important that you guys work together, on trying to figure out what is it that you're looking for, and what's the best route to getting, that goal accomplished ultimately.
Couldn't agree more, brother. The biggest mistake people make when refinancing, in my opinion, is extending their loan back 30 years just to save a couple of $100. Sure, your payment drops, but you're going to pay way more in the long run, all in all.
So yeah, guys, getting into the kind of the last section here, how to decide. I feel like some of this has been a little redundant, because ultimately when it comes to a refinance, you're going to have I guess your major kind of 4 or 5 pillars of things to look at. And obviously, that's what's going to help make your decision. But, the first thing is always going to be run the numbers, right? That's going to be the biggest driver of whether or not a refinance is going to make sense for you. And so looking at what do we owe now? what is our new loan amount going to be? What's our interest rate now? What's our new interest rate going to be? What is that going to produce for a monthly principal and interest payment? And what do we have right now? And then looking at what those net savings are going to be, right? So this would be in the case of, of a rate and term refinance. Obviously, in this instance, when all you're doing is affecting your rate or your term, you're going to want to look at where you're at now versus where you're going to be. And this is one of those situations where the money really has to make sense, right? Because if all you're getting out of a benefit of a refinance is lowering your interest rate, then how much you're paying in fees is really going to have to or I guess how much you're saving is really going to have to justify the fees that you're paying. So let's take a real life example and look at it, right? So let's say you have a $300,000 loan amount currently is what you owe on a 6.5% interest rate on a 30-year fixed. And then you're going to take out a new loan to pay off that 300,000. Now the rate's going to be at 5.5%. So you're going to save that 1% on a still 30-year term, right? And your closing costs are $4,500. Your new monthly principal and interest at the 5.5% is going to be, sorry, that's current. Your current monthly payment at 300,000, 6.5% is going to be $1,896 a month principal and interest. Your new monthly payment with the 1% lower interest rate at 5.5% is going to be $1,703. It's going to be a net savings of $193 a month. So if we look at that math, right, and we say, okay, let's take the cost of the refinance, $4,500, we divide that by $193, that's going to be 23 months. So basically, it's going to take you almost 2 years to recuperate that money. So if you're someone who, you're going to be in this house for a long time and, you've only been, let's just say you've been paying on your mortgage for a year or two, you're still relatively in the beginning part of the journey. So resetting the 30-year term is not a huge deal to you. And you're going to save yourself about $200 a month. You're going to be in the house the next 5-7 years. That that's more than going to pay for itself by the time that you reach year 2, right? You're basically have broken even, and everything else from there is just going to be, all net savings. So, that would be a situation, again, where it makes sense. I would say probably less than 2 years is always going to make sense for it. Not always, but less than 2 years is likely going to make sense when it comes to that refinance time period, when it comes to the cost. And so again, that's how you calculate your break even point. We're going to be really focused on 24 months and under. Anytime that you can break even in under 24 months, that's going to be a good call. Obviously, the quicker that you can break even when it comes down to 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, that's where okay, now we're getting into some real savings here, because that's, obviously going to be a huge benefit for you. Considering how long you'll stay in the home, again, this is kind of a tricky one, right? Ultimately, the future is not necessarily certain for anybody. So, there's always things that could take us, whether that's new jobs, whether that's, just wanting something new, whether that's needing to move to a new area or just get away from wherever, you're currently at, or, I don't know. There's a lot of reasons that could come up that may potentially cause you to move, but obviously use your best judgment in that moment of whether or not you think you're going to be there in that time frame for it to make sense. And then the last one, obviously, on how to decide is always going to be talk with a lender, a trusted lender, someone that is going to tell you the truth, someone that is going to, be honest with you. Again, this is not a situation where you should take this lightly. Ultimately, when refinancing, it should be something that's taken seriously because, again, you are starting your loan completely over from year 30, or potentially maybe, less than if you are, looking to change the term along with the interest rate. But, that's not something, again, to be taken lightly. It's something you should treat very seriously and, definitely use somebody who you can trust in that moment. So yeah, guys, before wrapping up here, I just wanted to talk about obviously what we kind of started the episode off with, right? And that's interest rates as a whole and just kind of the current market. Obviously, because of the interest rate market that we've been in, people obviously get very, very excited when they hear things like, oh, the Fed cut interest rates. Unfortunately, the Fed cutting interest rates does not directly impact mortgage rates, right? So mortgage interest rates are based on the 10-year treasury bond. And so yes, the market is going to react to the news of the Fed dropping interest rates, but that does not mean that if the Fed lowers interest rates by a quarter, that automatically mortgage interest rates are lowered by a quarter. That's not how it works. So it's something that you definitely want to be mindful of. Obviously, something you want to have those conversations with your lender about, but come to the understanding and realization that just because interest rates are being, are being dropped by the Fed, or they're being potentially talked about, hey, we're going to do two more cuts this year, or whatever the case may be, that does not directly impact interest rates themselves to make them lower by whatever the Fed lowers them. Yes, the market again is going to react to the news. However, that does not mean that interest rates are lower by a quarter. I just really want to emphasize that, because people get caught up on that a lot, and they think that just because that happened, or the Fed lowered interest rates, that all of a sudden, our mortgage rates are just so much better. That's not the way that it works. And so, I think it's definitely something where, hey, if you own a house currently, be very, very mindful of where the market is currently at. I'm not saying, don't pay attention. Obviously, you want to be in the know, start having those conversations with your lenders. And definitely get yourself maybe on some sort of a drip campaign or something that keeps you top of mind, and has, people thinking about you when rates do come down. But I would strongly urge just maybe some patience, right? If the Fed is truly going to lower interest rates another 2 times this year, why would refinancing at 6%, or why would refinancing at 6.25 make sense if in 6 months rates are going to be 5.5, right? You're basically losing out on money if you get in too early. And so that's another thing to think about is, we have to obviously be very cautious of that. We don't want to refinance too soon, because if rates continue to go down, then you basically lost savings at that point. And so there's no perfect science to it, but ultimately we've been at the high end of this interest rate market for the last 3 years, ever since, well, really going on almost four. Once, February of 2026 comes around, it'll be basically 4 years since February 2022, when rates started to go up. And so I feel like the pendulum is finally going to start swinging back the other way. So I do think that this is going to be a great opportunity sometime in the next 6 to 12, maybe 18 months to get a refinance. But again, something to be mindful of, definitely pay attention, but not something that you want to get in too early, because you don't want to miss, the potential rate savings down the road if rates do continue to go down. So something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, because ultimately it's not a good or a bad thing. It's really just about your situation, your timing, and what your math looks like all in all. It's just, you have to take into account all of the personal factors that go in, and ultimately a lender can decide that for you. The conversation's going to happen, but if you are going to be the only one that can make that decision ultimately when the numbers get put in front of you as well. So you just gotta, not everybody, just got to make sure that you realize that once you see those rates drop, that doesn't necessarily 100% mean you should always jump in for it. You just got to make sure that you take account of the scenario, situations, all the above. So
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. It's very, very nuanced. So, even if rates drop, doesn't mean that necessarily everybody is going to want to refinance their loan, right? So just keep that in mind. It's not a one size fits all. It's not, oh my gosh, rates are, 5%. That means everybody that was over 5% should just automatically refinance. Again, it's very, very nuanced. You need to look at everything when it comes to your loan, how long you have left to pay on it, what interest rate you're currently at. And what your situation looks like when it comes to debts, that sort of thing, and if it truly makes sense for you and the money that you're going to spend to do it. So but yeah, if you've been thinking about refinancing, or if you've been curious about rates, or there's anything out there that you wanted to have a conversation about, don't hesitate to reach out, let us know. You guys can message us on any of the platforms. If you guys follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, leave a comment under the video. We'd be more than happy to have that conversation with you guys and talk logistics over everything, and see if it's something that may make sense down the road for you to refinance. So
thank you guys again for tuning in. Hopefully you guys found some value on our episode today, and we will be seeing you guys on the next one. Have a great day.
all right, see you guys.